to another episode of History Hack. And you're probably tired of hearing one of us say this, but I have to do this or Alina will cut off my fingers. So, History Hack has its brand new website. If you haven't seen it yet, where the hell have you been? It should be in your favourites. It's historyhack.co.uk, where you can get cartoons, the merchandise, all drawn by Steve. So, better than if I'd drawn it. Or maybe I'll get Ollie to start drawing it, and also meet the team, that sort of thing. If you've enjoyed this episode, and believe me, you're going to enjoy this episode. You can't see me doing the Jedi mind trick, but you will enjoy this episode. Do hit like or 5-star, whatever the chosen liking format is on here, or leave us a comment. Probably something along the lines of Chris has got man flu, leave him alone. If you've really enjoyed the episode and you want to say thanks, you can buy us a drink at kofi.com/historyhack. Or if you really, really, really like us, and you'd like to subscribe for different perks from £1 a month upwards, you can get things like Chris perks, which I'm still not entirely happy about. My lawyers are still looking at, but I can't afford lawyers. So, in which you can get text messages, some of my hair, although I've just had it cut, so you might have to wait a while, or entry into books and early release episodes. Then head over to patreon.com/historyhack. Now that's out of the way. Let's move on to today's guest, because today we have something very, very interesting. Some historical person that's often overlooked. Not Alex Gough. He's the author. Alex Gough is he is indeed an author of Roman historical adventures. He's the author of the Carbo Chronicles, the Imperial Assassin, as well as having a lifelong obsession with ancient Rome. He now has an upcoming series on Mark Antony, and he's here to talk to us about Mark Antony and his rise to power. So, Alex, welcome to History Hack. How are you doing?
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on. Great, it's just a bit cold.
We have been dying to get someone to come and talk to us about Mark Antony. We talked about this very briefly, that he's kind of overlooked, really, especially even in your field.
It's interesting. He's very much overlooked on the fiction side, I think. There's quite a few popular biographies that have come out over the last 50 years or so, and the new ones actually only just come out this year. I think maybe Kindle last year, hardback this year. So he does get some notice from in the popular historical biographies, but they're not necessarily big sellers or ones that anyone would have read. But he's just such a pivotal character at a vitally important part of world history, and a fascinating character in his own right. So it is kind of surprising, and I guess it's the classic history being written by the victors as to why he gets overlooked.
Because when we think about Mark Antony, we tend to think of Richard Burton and Cleopatra, but he's a lot more than that. He had quite a rich backstory before meeting her.
Yeah, absolutely. So he was Cleopatra obviously was a major part of his life, but mainly towards the end. So the series I'm writing with the first one came out last summer, called Caesar's Soldier, and that recounts his life up to his war in Gaul with Caesar. And then the second one, which is just coming out this week as we record, takes him from the end of the Gallic War up to the Ides of March. And by that time, he only really met Cleopatra a couple of times. So I'm now 2/3 of the way through writing the third book, in which Cleopatra's name is vaguely mentioned, and I think she'll make a bit of an appearance in the last sort of quarter of the book. And then the fourth book in the series will be very much centered around Cleopatra. But yeah, he had this absolutely fascinating life way before Cleopatra had anything to do with him, although he did apparently meet her when she was very young. And I do recount their meeting, which in Plutarch's eyes was a kind of love at first sight thing. In my story, she's a spotty adolescent teenager who he's really not very interested in. So, which I think is probably more appropriate for the age gap.
I mean, if you were a 30, 40-year-old man, would you really be looking at what she must have been, 12, 13 years old at the time?
She's about 13 at the time, yeah. She was she was a very rich princess, so she did have that going in her favour. And of course, different times. I mean, as we all know, Juliet was 13 in Romeo and Juliet, wasn't she? So things happened back then that were different from now. But no, I think both from what I know of Mark Antony, he never seemed to show any interest in anyone who was particularly young. He made kind of rather the opposite. I think he was much more interested in more mature women, and also just writing in modern times. It'd be a bit distasteful to to put that in anyway. But I mean, we talk about him being kind of not just Cleopatra, but yeah, he was. I think he was quite a nice guy, and I think he generally treated his women quite well. So that was good to know. But in terms of him, sort of, yeah, as I say, his life before Cleopatra, there was so much to it. He started off. I mean, if I give a potted biography, I guess might be helpful. He started off in a noble but poor family, and his grandfather was Marcus Antonius, was the foremost orator of his time, and Cicero greatly admired him and based a lot of his style on him. But he was killed in Sulla's prescriptions, and the family kind of went downhill a bit from there. His father was also called Marcus Antonius, who had the surname Creticus, and this was kind of ironic because he'd been given a command against some pirates, which he'd done particularly badly in. And he'd supposedly won a minor victory in Crete, so he was given this cognomen of Creticus was as an honorific, but it was a bit of a joke because he hadn't really earned it, and it also meant man of chalk as a double entendre. So he died shortly after that, and then Mark Antony's stepfather Lentulus, his mother's new husband, was then implicated in the Catiline conspiracy, which was Cicero's big moment, and Cicero had Mark Antony's stepfather executed without trial, and then refused to release his body for burial. And Mark Antony is about 17 years old at this stage, so this is the kind of the start of the big enmity between Cicero and Mark Antony. And though a lot of people think that, most people think that it's a lifelong enmity, that this latest biography that's come out about him suggests that they may have been more friendship in certain aspects of their life. But I've definitely chosen to concentrate on on Cicero as the antagonist of the story.
Can you just explain to our listeners? Some of them may not know what the Catiline conspiracy was. I mean, is this one of the subjects you do cover in the book?
Yeah, it takes up a good chunk of the first part of the book. So this is when Caesar was a young politician after the dictator Sulla had died. Rome was kind of gone back to being a republic in the traditional sense. But there were a lot of dissatisfied nobles who were very poor, with very good aristocratic lines, and Catiline was one of them, and he tried to lead a rebellion against Rome. He was this very charismatic leader and had a huge following, but Cicero reasonably cleverly managed to uncover the plot and forced him out of Rome. He was eventually defeated in battle, and but all the conspirators or a lot of conspirators that were alongside him were executed at the time. So it probably didn't have a huge impact on Roman history as such, because it wasn't necessarily as big as Cicero made it out to be, because for Cicero it's all about the glory. He became named father of the country, because he saved the country from this rebellion. But its importance to a large extent comes because it was the foundation of Cicero's fame and political career, while the importance to my book is that it was the foundation of the enmity between Cicero and Antony.
So before he joins the military, when he's a young man, because war service does change you and the way you interact with things. What was he like as a young man?
So he was immensely in debt. He's so at 17 years old, he's head of the household because his father and his stepfather are both dead. He, like a lot of youngsters of his age, was living a highly dissolute life, getting drunk, partying, having numerous affairs. And he was great friends with two other notable tearaways at the time, one called Clodius and one called Curio. Clodius was a little bit older and was effectively kind of almost led his own rebellion, or was along those lines, and he was a massive enemy of Cicero's as well. So Clodius was famously murdered on the Appian Way by one of Cicero's adherents. So, but he hung out a lot with Curio, who fortunately had a rich father, so Curio kind of bankrolled his profligate lifestyle. But eventually he had to kind of get himself together, and in his mid-20s probably he went off to Athens to study philosophy and get his academic training and learning how to be a good orator and these sorts of things. And while he was there, he got headhunted by a chap called Aulus Gabinius, who was on his way to take over the governorship of Syria, and thought that a young man with some good ancestry might be a suitable officer to come with him. So he headed off to the east to take part in his first battles.
Right, you started it, we've got to finish it. Let's talk about his military career, because he's not just some random young guy in the Roman military. He does actually rise. Well, he rise to prominence. He's a badass. He is not someone who's going to be stuck with a sword. He's going to be up there with the command eventually.
I mean, yeah, he's great. I mean, that is, of all his characteristics, it's his military prowess that is the thing that really stands out. And of course, his two great enemies throughout his life are Cicero and Octavian, who are the complete opposites. Octavian keeps missing battles because he feels ill, and Cicero doesn't know which way up to hold a sword anyway. Neither of them show conspicuous bravery throughout their lives, whereas Mark Antony is, from the start of his career to the end of it, he's in the forefront, fighting alongside his men, sharing their hardships. He goes through more than once. He goes through at times of retreat where he shows his best characteristics by sharing all the sort of lack of food and lack of water, and holding his men together in the worst of circumstances. He wasn't a brilliant strategist in the same way that you might Caesar was, for example, but he was a sound tactician, and he was brave and bold when he needed to be. And he was also a bit of a brute. All the sources say that he was physically very strong, and so he could kind of dominate any physical area he was in, and whether even if you're in a political debate with him, I can imagine that having the bulky Mark Antony towering over you would have been rather intimidating. And it's interesting when you see who've played him in the past, and we'll come on to this, I'm sure. But when you look at some of the fine actors that have played him, they've all got a certain presence, I think, but I don't think any of them really show his actual physical ability, physical characteristics, and I think he'd probably physically prove better played by someone like The Rock than Charlton Heston.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
Yeah, I don't know what he's got, or Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mark Antony. Might not quite have the dramatic range, but
I'm here to conquer Gaul.
Yeah, I come here to bury Caesar. Yeah. But yeah, he was involved in a lot of battles. He fought in Syria under Aulus Gabinius, and then he restored Queen Cleopatra's father to the throne of Egypt. He was instrumental in that, and this demonstrates kind of some of his merciful characteristics. He won this battle in this place called Pelusium, which was the gateway to Egypt, which allowed the Romans to advance and take over Egypt. And Ptolemy the 12th came along, who'd been in exile for a few years, and came along on his coattails and demanded that he massacre the population in reprisal for holding out against him. And Mark Antony, despite being a very junior officer at this time, turned around and told the king of Egypt, "Not on your Nelly, I'm not doing that." So stood up to him. So fair play. And from there, because at that point Caesar was I think at this point Mark Antony's kind of debts were getting on top of him. He went straight from Syria to where he was invited to by Caesar to Gaul, bypassing Rome, where he'd probably been arrested for bankruptcy. So he then went to fight in Gaul, maybe fought in Britannia when Caesar's second expedition. We've got no evidence for that, but the timeline fits, and Caesar wasn't very generous in crediting his junior officers. So in my book, I've got him fighting in Britannia. And then the very exciting bit and the climax of the first book is the Battle of Alesia, which is an absolute stonker of a battle at the end of the Gallic War. And in this, Mark Antony is named in Caesar's commentaries, and he plays a conspicuously heroic role.
So yeah, you've already mentioned him. We can't really talk about Rome in this period without mentioning Julius Caesar. What was Mark Antony's sort of relationship with him?
So yeah, very mixed actually. He was a distant relative. I can't quite work out exactly what you'd call it, and maybe a third cousin or something like that. His mother was called Julia, which shows the sort of the relationship there. And so again, like Gabinius, I think Caesar was quite happy to have a young soldier officer with a good name to come and join him. It was good for his career to have those sorts of people adhering to his cause, and also Antony had started to prove himself as a soldier. But I think until Alesia, and Caesar hadn't really noticed Antony in any great deal, in any great way. But after that, I think he started to promote him and to favour him. And actually, when the Civil War started, Antony who'd been acting as Caesar's tribune in Rome, and was kind of, well, according to Cicero, it's his fault the Civil War started because he got beaten up trying to defend Caesar's cause in Rome, and he fled to Caesar, and that was when Caesar decided to cross the Rubicon. And so Caesar at this point was kind of favouring him as his favourite, whereas Caesar's previous favourite, a chap called Labienus, who was his deputy and who actually won a lot of battles on Caesar's behalf, took umbrage at this and defected to Pompey. So that was quite a major moment, but sealed Antony's dominance within Caesar's camp. But after that, I mean, he was after Caesar was away fighting. He left Antony at certain points. He left Antony in charge in Italy, and Antony made a little bit of a hash of it. I mean, he didn't necessarily have the best of circumstances, but there were various moments where he kind of let events run away with him, and he also lived it very large, his dissolute lifestyle. So he was driving around Italy with a supposedly a chariot led by lions, and he had his actress mistress in the front of his carriages, and had all his actor friends. And actors were the lowest of the low. I mean, if you were as a legal category, there were various things put against you for being an actor, that you couldn't marry or vote or various other things, because he was so disreputable. So Caesar didn't really like this aspect of him, but ultimately they did patch things up, and by the time Caesar's end came, Antony was consul, which allowed him to then be the supreme. When Caesar died, he was effectively the power in Rome.
Before we move on to Caesar and Pompey and the end of Caesar and blah, 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 I want to talk about something that's not actually on the questions. I'm kind of diverging a little bit, but I want to talk about Mark Antony's love life. Not Cleopatra, because obviously that's going to be further on in your books, but I want to talk about his earlier love life. So, for example, his first wife, I do want to also concentrate on Fulvia as well a little bit here.
Yeah,
But let's start with his earlier love life. Who was his first wife? And when do we know when they got married?
we don't even know if they got married. So there was a lady called Fadia, who was the daughter of a freedman, sorry, and we only know about her through Cicero. So Cicero wrote these 14 speeches that were entirely devoted to assassinating Antony's character. He named them after the speeches that Demosthenes gave against Alexander's father. So he called them himself the Philippics. So we know a lot of the details of Antony's life from the way that Cicero twisted them to blacken his name. So the fact that he supposedly married this woman, according to Cicero, he married this woman called Fadia, who was the daughter of a freedman, so quite low in the pecking order. It's controversial as to whether that was Cicero's exaggeration, but she probably existed, and she may have been a consort, or he may have been happy to outrage society and genuinely married her. But we don't really know what happened to her. He possibly had children by her, but we don't think they survived, or we don't know anything about them. So he then as he's in his settling down stage of life, he then married his cousin Antonia, who he had a daughter who was also called Antonia, and whose father, his uncle, was a highly disreputable and rather cruel politician. And that would seem to me a rather loveless marriage that was a marriage of convenience and politics, and that ended when he believed she was seeing one of his political rivals called Dolabella. So he divorced her, by which time Fulvia had been widowed for the second time. So she had first married one of Antony's best friends, Clodius, who I mentioned earlier. He was then murdered, as I mentioned earlier. She then married Antony's other friend, best friend, Curio, who then died fighting for Caesar in the Civil War, at which point she became available. So I think there was, well, I know there was genuine affection between Antony and Fulvia, and to many, in many respects, it almost seems like she was the love of his life. They were together a long time. She guided his early career. I think Cicero makes some sort of comment that Cleopatra was lucky that that Fulvia taught Antony to be a good husband to a dominant woman, something along those lines, anyway. But Fulvia was one of those women who, if she'd lived in a different age, would have been very much a force in her own right. But because of the patriarchy, she had to operate from behind the scenes, and I think it's a little bit difficult to know how much of Antony's career up until that point was of his own volition and how much of it was guided by Fulvia. But I kind of think of it as more of a partnership. I definitely think there was a lot of both going on. But she was a very, very powerful, forceful woman. But there was definite love there as well. There was a time when Caesar was away fighting and Antony had gone to meet him, but hearing that Caesar had been killed, which he hadn't, he went back home disguised as a slave, and he took a letter he had written to Fulvia, and he handed it to her still disguised as this slave, and she read it, and it was full of professions of love for Fulvia from Antony, and she started to cry, at which point he threw off his disguise and embraced her lovingly. So it could be a bit of a sweetie.
What a way to trick the one you love. I'm just going to check if she truly loves me. I'm going to dress as a slave, and that's a bit extreme.
Well, if you looked at it in through a modern lens, possibly, but if you look at it in Roman times, I mean, that would the fact that he was actually showing outward signs of love towards his wife would probably have been frowned upon.
Yeah, that's true. They're supposed to be marriages of convenience, not marriages of love. Who cares?
A lot of them. I mean, Pompey was supposedly besotted with Julius Caesar's daughter, and the reason, and that was a big cause of their rupture when she died.
Yeah, but she was 18, wasn't she?
Yes, there was a very big age gap, but there was a thing at the time where there was kind of outrage that or shock that Pompey didn't take any other lovers while he was married to Julius Caesar's daughter, and no one could quite understand it, I think.
Chris, there's still a chance for you.
No, I'm good.
Yes.
Because basically all this love stories have reminded me how single, bitter, and alone I am. So I'm going to move back to something I might prefer more. So he marches with. It's much more interesting. I don't have to. I can deal with that. He marches with Caesar against Pompey. So this is quite a dangerous time for him, isn't it?
Yeah. So he's so basically after the Rubicon. So he's run away from Rome, being chased out by the senatorial factions and Pompey, and he goes to Caesar. At this point, Pompey's basically said, "Don't worry, everybody. I can just if I just stamp my foot, then soldiers will come up out of the ground across Italy to defend us." Caesar's been waiting at the border of Italy, where he's legally not allowed to enter. And when he finds out what's happened to the way Antony's been treated, he basically is kind of the last straw, and he says, well, if they're going to treat a tribune whose person, is supposedly inviolable like this, then there's no chance of peace, so I'm going to invade. So he takes a single legion, just 5,000 men across the border, and basically just marches at full speed towards Rome, taking a few cities along the way. And at which point Pompey and all the senators run away with a few choice words about where are all these soldiers that are supposed to spring up out of the ground, Pompey. So they all fly to Greece to try and raise more troops. And Caesar, after some preparation, so Caesar first goes off to Spain to deal with some other rebels, or some other Pompeians there, to get rid of them first. This is when he leaves Antony in charge at Rome for the first time, which he doesn't mess up too badly. So Caesar then takes him with him to Greece, and this is when Caesar's forced to split into two, one led by him and one led by Antony, and Antony's kind of bringing up the reserve to reinforce Caesar, and while he's trying to cross the sea to get to Greece, against inclement weather. Caesar is sort of hanging on by his fingernails. He's about to be overcome in this situation. Antony kind of arrives with some tactical brilliance to trick the besieging fleets and get across, and relieve Caesar in the nick of time. And then together they fight the Battle of Pharsalus, which is the victory over Pompey, and what's effectively, although there's some battles afterwards, that's effectively the decisive battle of the Civil War, and Mark Antony's leading one of the wings there. But it's definitely one of those moments where history could change, but everything could change for Mark Antony as well, and it could, as one side collapses, the other side's advancing. If it had just been slightly different, then Pompey would have won, the world would have been different, and Mark Antony would have probably been executed on the spot.
We're going to actually end up stopping at the Ides of March,
Mm.
because that's where your book stops. Even though however
Yeah.
much I want to talk about Antony and Cleopatra, but everybody talks about Antony and Cleopatra. Because it's this tragic love story. Everybody likes a bit of a tragic love story. Like, oh, Chris doesn't like a tragic love story. He's shaking his head. I'll let Chris jump in and make his argument here.
Just my life is a tragic love story. I've done with them.
Well, Cleopatra she's not absent from these books. So he spends a bit of time with her in the first book when she's a child, and although he starts off viewing her as a spotty, annoying adolescent, once he's actually she's shown him around Alexandria, he realizes that there's something interesting in her personality, even if it's not of any particular attraction to him at that age. And then the next time they meet is after Caesar's brought her back to Rome from Alexandria, where Caesar's kind of just finished off the Civil War over there. And so Antony again gets to know her a little bit better when she's now an adult in Rome. But Antony's kind of wrapped up with Fulvia at this stage. But there's kind of a bit of a friendly, maybe slightly flirty thing going on between them up to the stage where this second book has finished. But she really disappears right off the radar after that, because after Caesar's death, she hangs around briefly, but then she runs away to Alexandria, with Caesar's son with her, who is in obviously a very precarious position if Caesar's dead and his son hasn't been legitimized, and Caesar's nominated a different heir in Octavian. It's I think it's going to be really interesting writing the final book in the series, because and I've got to try and work out how to handle it as well. This will come in at the end of this series, because I do think there's a lot of love between Antony and Fulvia, but he goes off and starts his affair with Cleopatra while he's still married to Fulvia, and Fulvia then starts a war without Antony, which he doesn't really approve of. So that has a rather tragic ending. And then Cleopatra, there's as many different ways to portray her as there are Antony, if not more. I mean, she was a brilliant woman. She was, spoke umpteen languages, and she was seen to be a very canny political operator and very intelligent. And her beauty seems, from contemporary reports, to not have been particularly her main feature. It was her amazingly captivating personality and her intelligence, etc., that made people fall in love with her. But I think there was also a somewhat disingenuous side to her, and slightly potentially duplicitous side. And so I've got to decide exactly how I play their final downfall together, because there are two different ways I could do it, and one shows her in a better light than the other.
I think it's interesting because he's kind of at that point. I mean, we're not going to talk about it too much today, but he's a man stuck in between two women. One is his love, Fulvia, who will do anything for him. She's been there. I believe. So my theories behind it are that she did help him rise to where he is. Without her help, he would not have been the man that he is today. So he's got to be thankful. But at the same time, he's captivated by this, and she doesn't necessarily have to be conventionally beautiful. To him, she is attractive. She is the most beautiful woman in the world, because her intelligence, and if you're an adult and not a child, you look more into what somebody is like rather than well, okay, not I can't speak for everybody, but you look at more the person on the inside rather than the person on the outside, and that's what the person on the inside makes the person on the outside, and that's what Cleopatra is. She's gorgeous on the inside, which makes her incredibly alluring and attractive on the outside. Yeah, so you got a really difficult job.
Yeah, I know. It's. I mean, I think it's obviously I'm writing Antony from a sympathetic point of view, and you could easily write him, and people do write him from the opposite point of views. But so I like to, if out of a choice of two, I tend to choose the better of two looks for Antony, which includes it maybe explaining why he lost battles or things when maybe he wouldn't have. And I think it's possible that Cleopatra has a little bit of blame to take for some of the problems he had towards the end. But equally, I think he was very happy with Cleopatra as well, and he didn't. I don't think they overlapped with the affair didn't overlap with his wife for that many years. So it was doesn't necessarily make it a good thing, but. So it's really going to be really interesting to write it. But I've been saying about the thing with the how you choose to write a character. Obviously, if I'm going to write 4 books about someone, I want it to be someone I like. And as I did the research, I found out to my relief that he did seem to be quite a nice guy. He was nice to his women. He was respectful to his enemies. He treated the bodies of enemies fallen in battle well. He was very loyal to his friends. Whereas if you look at Cicero, and he's someone who, if you go, I'm on a lot of sort of Facebook groups and things with different Roman themes, and Cicero really divides the world. There's so many people who love him and think he's this wonderful guy, philosopher and orator and this brave politician. But there are a lot of other people who also can't stand him because they think he's a coward and he's duplicitous and he's self-serving and vain. And
He's an asshole. That's what he is. He's an
well,
asshole. Look, in
the
blatant terms, he is a class A asshole. But I'm not going to say that he's not an intelligent man, because Cicero is very intelligent. He's
yeah.
a good strategist. He knows what he wants and how he wants it. But he's also an asshole, and he does it in really brutal ways. He basically gets the job done.
Yeah, he was entirely self-serving. Everything was about his own glory, possibly come from his humble roots. I think that was always made him paranoid about his position in society. But then, so if you contrast him with how I've written him with how Robert Harris has written him, you'd almost be writing about two different people because Robert Harris has very much idolized him, I think, in many ways. And it's quite amusingly, my editor, I got a new editor at my publishing house, Canello's. My previous editor moved to a different job and within the company, and the new chap who took over is a relatively young, well compared to me, chap who's a classics graduate. He really loves Cicero. He's one of those real fanboys. So he's editing my book while I'm ripping Cicero to pieces, and he's having to grit his teeth and put up with it. So when I meet up with him for lunch, I do give him a little bit of teasing about that.
I've got to tell you, I know what you mean about Robert Harris, and this is what I keep bringing this up on the podcast recently, but I literally inhaled his 3 books on Cicero. And part of me reading that makes me feel sorry for Cicero. It does. It does bring out all of these emotions of, oh, well, maybe he wasn't such big of a prick, but he is. And I keep having to hold on to that part of me thinking, yeah, he was an arsehole. He was all about himself, all about his money. And, he didn't care about his wife. He didn't care about, his daughter. He didn't care about his son. He didn't care about anyone but himself.
I think cared about his daughter. That may be the only thing in the world he cared about, as much more than himself.
Oh, and a good marriage for her.
I think he was. Oh, the marriage was pretty bad. But actually, I think the marriage to Dolabella was organised while he was away, and he didn't by his wife, and he didn't actually get much say in that. He was absolutely distraught when his daughter died, and I think that's maybe one of his most human features. But if you ever are wondering whether you think Cicero's is one of the good guys, the bad guys, there's a moment in a trial where he's defending a young chap, and there's something from his past comes up where he's accused of a young man of raping an actress, and Cicero basically says, well, he's a young man, that's what young men do, and she was an actress, and that's what they're for.
Yeah, class A prickness right there.
Yeah,
class A prickness. I can't stand. There we go. So at least you and I are on the same side that we dislike Cicero. I don't know where Chris stands on this.
I agree. After
Are
that,
you
It's
agreeing because
hard not to after the last one.
yeah. Before I was kind of on the fence, and now I was like, yeah, no, you can't defend that. That's really horrible.
Yeah. I think even at the time, I think people noticed that was not a
No.
nice thing to say, and this is a pretty brutal time as it was. So.
No, but lawyers aren't great anyway. There's no lawyers listening, are there?
Let's hope not.
I'll see you in court later.
I think you can't libel the dead, can you? And Cicero's definitely dead.
Yeah, but we mentioned earlier about portrayals and Richard Burton, but Alina tells me that the ultimate portrayal of Mark Antony was James Purefoy in Rome, and that's probably the best one that's been done. Would you agree with that?
Yes, largely. I think I love that series, and I love James Purefoy in that and other stuff. And I think he does Mark Antony in a way that's different from. And is that and he's hot, Alina? Is that the sign you're making there?
Oh, he is. I've got to tell you, there is something so seductive about it. He plays in such a, he is. He's a bit of a fuckboy, right? He is. He's a bit of a fuckboy. He is, but he's so charming about it, and I could never say no. If Mark Antony asked me, or James Purefoy playing Mark Antony, asked me to run around the building naked, I would do it.
So he's basically me then.
Of course. I think James has got those aspects. James Purefoy's got those aspects of him down perfectly. His seductive nature, his potential to be violent, and his drunkenness and things like this. I think maybe he's missed out on some of the nuance, and obviously Rome's. There's only so much nuance you can fit into a small series. But I think his things like his loyalty to his friends and his kindness to women doesn't show up at all in Rome. I don't think. Fulvia isn't even in it. She's kind of some sort of. I read that Attia, Octavian's mother, who was not at all like that, is some sort of combination of Fulvia and Clodia and something, and just kind of a dreamed up combination of those. But no, I think he does them really well. But then you've also got these great portrayals, some of which were Shakespeare, some of which weren't. So you've got Charlton Heston and Marlon Brando and obviously Richard Burton all playing him, and they're all up until the Rome series, they were all basically based on Plutarch, because Shakespeare was based on Plutarch. Antony and Cleopatra with Elizabeth Elizabeth Taylor was also based on Plutarch, so they haven't necessarily gone for the full range of sources. And of course, you can't forget Sid James and Carry On Cleo, so it's another classic portrayal then. But one thing I did read as quite early on in my research, I found this PhD thesis by a lady who was comparing how Mark Antony was portrayed on screen in the 20th and 21st centuries. It's really interesting. Basically, in a few lines, it can be summed up as saying that people are always trying to accentuate his flaws. And in the 20th century, those flaws were his femininity. So the fact that when he was with Cleopatra, he was wearing perfume and dressed up in fine clothes and wearing makeup and giving into sensuality, and that was bad. And then in he should have been more butch and masculine, etc. In the 21st century, his flaws were the opposite. His flaws under James Purefoy was his toxic masculinity, his aggression, his violence, the way he treated women. And so it's a really interesting contrast that although he's usually portrayed by his flaws, what society thinks those flaws are has changed.
Mark Antony deserves his own TV show based on your books.
Well, it's hard to disagree with. any unbiased person would think the same, I'm sure.
I think it'd be really great. I mean, finally, then in your books, it can be shown, different things can be shown. We can get rid of some of these bad energy against Mark Antony, because in all, I really like him through any of the work that I've ever done. He's never come back as a bad person.
No, I think it's quite hard to find a Roman who isn't a bad person when you really look into them. I mean, Octavian Augustus was pretty nasty, and a lot of the people you call great were often had really horrible skeletons in their cupboards, like Constantine the Great killed his own son. And I've got my other series, the Imperial Assassin series, which is it's based in the reign of Caracalla, and was described by Gibbons as the common enemy of mankind because he was so evil. But his story was written by a chap called Cassius Dio, who was a contemporary senator who hated him. And actually, if you read what he actually did, he's no better or worse than any of the other emperors. He just happens to be, derided as the worst. But he was, he had some very good points. He had some very bad points. So I think that's whereas Mark Antony, I think he's got some flaws, but a lot of them are flaws that you can kind of sympathise with. He's a bit of a one with the ladies. He gets a bit drunk. He wrote a treatise on his own drunkenness. That's one of his only works of literature, which sadly doesn't survive. So you generally what people tend to think of as flaws, you still sort of think about their flaws, but they're kind of lovable flaws.
Alex, this has been amazing. We finally plugged a gap that I've wanted to plug, and we got to have a really, really good chat about it. Listen, remind our listeners remind them of all of your series.
Okay, so the first three is set in it's a kind of Jack Reacher-esque book. It's the Carbo of Rome series, starting with Watchmen of Rome. The second series are the Imperial Assassin series, set in the reign of Caracalla and following some spies around doing things across the empire. And that one starts with Emperor's Sword. And then the current series is the 4-book series about Mark Antony, and Caesar's Soldier and Caesar's General are out now, with Caesar's Avenger and Caesar's Nemesis to come.
Fabulous. We will get your book into our bookshop, which means you get a big slice of the money, we get a smaller slice of the money, and that Riverside, Chris does this so much better than I do, that Riverside Amazon, and I've already said the word twice, never mind, that place will not get to make their Death Star. Chris, is that what it is?
Yeah, it's always a Death Star. You can't go wrong with Death Stars.
Yeah, I'm going to roll with the Death Star. If you like this episode or any other episodes, you can leave us a 5-star shiny review on Apple or any other device that you listen to this on. You can put in anything. We really don't care. Just something. You also can head to our new website, which is www.historyhack.co.uk, where we have bio merch and all that kind of shizzle. You can also leave us a one-off donation on Ko-fi, which is ko-fi/historyhack. I need to fund that plant habit. And yeah, FYI, I did buy another plant today. Do not tell anybody that I just did that. You can also become a Patreon supporter on www.patreon.com/historyhack. Lots of different perks out there, especially with Chris's hair, but you need to wait till it grows back, if it grows back. So that was great having you guys on. I'm going to leave you with my joke of the day. So the question is, why do melons have weddings? Because they cantaloupe. Thanks very much, guys.